Welcome back to another episode of Complete Human Performance Radio. I am your host for this episode, Anthony D'Orazio, PhD, and today I am joined by two of the nicest, most awesome people you could ever meet. They are strength coaches, they are powerlifters, they are Christian and Julia Anto. How are you two doing today?
We're great.
Doing great. We're doing great.
Mm-hmm.
Surviving, getting through. So we are recording this in early December. It's probably going to come out early January. Are you ready for the holiday season?
So the Christmas holiday season, as ready as we're going to be, we're both really big into Halloween. So we felt like we were taking down all those decorations way too fast. However, this year we were able to hold on to a little bit better weather. So last week was super cold. This week is kind of like that transition week of the majority of the days are really cold. Today and tomorrow are supposed to be like just inside the 40, high 40s, low 50s. But this is kind of when like it gets dark real early up here in the Midwest and it just stays colder and colder and colder. So this year is nice because we have a kind of a buffing period. Last year it was like there was no buffing period. It just went straight to super rainy and then super cold right away.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is nice. I know I still have to get my car switched off of its summer sport tires.
Yeah.
So I have to get that done the next week or two. So I have you two on to talk about a couple things, and the first thing I want to get into is a topic I forewarned you about. And this is because Christian, I know you particularly tend to post a lot of videos on your Instagram highlighting young developing athletes. So teenage athletes, maybe young teen, preteen. So I guess I want to start there and talk about that because it's something we haven't really addressed on this particular podcast is young athlete development. So I guess let's just start very generally and then we can sort of get into specifics. What are your general approaches to dealing with young athletes, and what do you think most parents or coaches get wrong with young and developing athletes?
So my opinions and kind of approaches have changed, I would say, over the last 4 years. Moving up to the Midwest, I was fortunate enough to one have Julia as a director for Parisi, so she got to see a lot of development from that angle. But also, we linked up with a very um, thorough chiropractor, as his chiropractic is his base, but he is very intrigued with movement. And over the last years, his big kind of driver was the DNS system, which is revolving around children development. And their big thing is like humans, older adults should be able to move like they were when they were kids. So now try and jokingly I mash, okay, you have this meathead powerlifter trying to like learn these concepts of DNS, of like child movement. Like I can't do half of the things that DNS kind of like requires people to do. However, when we talk about child development, it starts to make sense. So you start to see, kind of like with any athlete that you get into, you can start to see these downfalls or these gaps in what younger and younger kids are lacking ability to do. So that's kind of my first thing. Is we always talk about when you bring people into the gym or you do any type of evaluation, there's you can do like forms and ask questions. That doesn't really work with kids, but you actually go through these movement screens, and you're not going to go through a stereotypical movement screen with younger kids. You got to make them move in a way that they want to move, because training kids, if they're not having fun, you're not going to get really good feedback with it. So having them do movements that kind of fall within these appropriate age ranges, right? Because the DNS system kind of goes by age ranges. And if they can do compound movements with these peripheral cues that I'm looking for over here, it can kind of paint a picture of, hey, these individuals are really good at this particular thing over here. They're lacking this particular thing over here. So it varies to some degree with how they're raised, what kind of activities that they're in, but then you can go down all kinds of rabbit holes with certain scenarios of if kids were what do they call them, like W sitters, where like you sit with your knees like tucked back and winged out like for long periods of time. Things like that aren't necessarily great for development because that's going to decrease your ability to use your glutes. So like all of these different positions that people can be in all end up coming together in these movement patterns that you can kind of see. So generally speaking, having the understanding of what these systems do, you can apply and kind of make a move in any given way and start to paint a picture of what they need help with.
I think we also see, at least up here where, and I don't know, maybe it's because of the weather, we don't have like, we have a long stretch of cold weather in the winter. The kids we've seen an uprise in getting them involved in their sport of choice year round. And even though we don't have warm weather up here to like play baseball in the winter, they're like playing baseball indoors all year round. And so they're kind of lacking, the parents are pushing more towards the specific skill development of the sport rather than general athleticism. And then that's kind of where we have to end up honing in with the parents and the coaches to say, you're almost like you're trying to do too much sports specific stuff with your kid when they're really not, they don't have the physical ability to do those things yet. You're asking them to do XYZ when they can't even, squat their own body weight properly. So that's our job then, is to mediate that and say, maybe let's do, instead of 4 days a week of baseball or swimming or whatever sport it is, let's try to fit in a couple days of movement and strength work and movement prep type stuff. So we try to be that buffer between the parents and the coaches, and some are really good and open to it, and some it's a struggle and a fight.
So. Do you feel so jumping on that point, because that was actually something I was going to ask Julia, do you feel there's a general trend in parents pushing that sort of, do be more specific all year long? Or do we feel like that's something that's existed the last, 2-3 decades?
I think it is more in, well, from what I've seen, I would say the last, probably the last 10 to 20 years. When I started coaching, and I was coaching at Buffalo, at University of Buffalo 20 years ago, I think a lot of those kids were those one sport, one directional, all season long kids. But I can't say for certain, but it seems more prevalent now. And I'm wondering if it's because those parents that are now parents of young kids were, oh man, I would have been better if I would have played all year round. Do you see what I'm saying? So how it's sort of developed into this, like, if I played all year round when I was that age, I would have been, I could have made pros. And so then they end up sort of pushing their kids to be like that. I don't know if that's exactly what it is, but I could see how that would happen. So I would say within the last 10 to 20 years, I think more parents are, and I don't know if it's all parental. I think the majority of it is. I think some of it comes from the kids, where the kids are like, Mom, I want to do more. I want to play baseball. I want to go to hitting lessons. I want to, do extra work here and there. I think very rarely is the parent the one that has to pull the reins back on the kid. I think the parents are often the ones that are going, you need to, let's do more of this. Let's play club this. Let's play, do extra lessons and things.
And I would say that's one of the biggest things that I've seen trickle down is everybody talks about systems in place for progression. And then the more we see these kids trying to specialize, all of a sudden you look peripherally and see the organizations that have popped up, especially in travel anything, right? So when I was growing up, it was big to make like a select soccer team,
Right.
and maybe once every other month we would travel 3 hours away for a tournament. I mean, our daughter just got onto a travel club volleyball team. They're traveling, like they're top tier levels. These girls are freshmen and sophomores in high school, and they are literally traveling, and you're having to stay in hotels, and you're paying thousands of dollars to be part of a club to generate stud athletes to try and push. There's big money in club, huge money in club, because when these club systems start to pair up with these um, colleges and all of these like onboarding systems,
Mhm.
it starts to get really, really tricky, because now these kids and parents are being sold on, if you want to get to here, you have to go through this channel. And it's trying to make a one-stop shop, and there's so many
Well,
issues
it's
in there.
interesting you bring that up because 20 years ago, a club team, how many kids made? There was one club team in the
Yeah.
area and 15 kids made that team. And now it's like, then somebody was like, well, I'm going to start my own club. And then I'm going to start another club. And so now it's like, and he's like he said, high schools and the colleges, like it's really hard. If you're not on a club team, you end up losing so much, whether it's exposure or things like that. So it's really, the parents are kind of pressured to put in. This is our daughter's second year of playing club volleyball, and it's like it's a whole new ball game. But we also made it sort of a thing with her where we said, if you're going to play club volleyball, you're also going to be in the weight room, you're going to do your rehab exercises, all of those things. And I think that's sort of where, as parents, if they can understand that there has to be that balance, then they're really helping their child's development.
And this isn't just talking about like high school age kids. Like this goes all the way down to like
8, 9 years
early,
old. Yeah.
early middle school.
Mm-hmm.
So you've opened up a lot of questions I have now. One of which, Christian, I was just about to ask, Christian, you just started to touch on, was, how far down do you see this go? And where do you think it's actually appropriate? Like, so let's say I had a child and they're, I'm maybe, early on, they're 5, 6, 7 years old. I'm having them play a bunch of different sports, just having fun, being kids. At what point in their development is it appropriate to say, okay, now we can maybe start to really focus? Is that something that maybe, my thought would maybe be like junior, senior year of high school? Like, I don't, in my opinion, not that I've worked with children this age, but just going back to my own high school, like, before my freshman, sophomore year of high school, certainly, and probably not really until my junior year, I didn't have the physical ability, like Julia was pointing out earlier, to really, you know, do much of anything. Like training, like did I run all year long effectively? Yes. But like switching between cross country and track was enough of a switch where, with what my focus was, I was taking enough time off where I don't think like me training track, sprints all year long would have done me any good. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have opinions on that? And sort of following up on that. So a second question, because you guys, I could tell, like to answer a lot all at once, which is great. Is at what point do you know? Like I wasn't gonna make the pros in anything. Like that wasn't gonna happen, right? And obviously, for most athletes or high school athletes, middle school athletes, that's not going to happen. Just the law of numbers says it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
At what point do you sit there and realize, either as an athlete or as a parent, go, okay, me spending thousands of dollars chasing my child's dream is maybe like I can look at them objectively and be like, I love them to death, but I also know there's no chance they're top end a D2 athlete, which is still an amazing athlete. Don't get me wrong, it is a phenomenal athlete, but they're not going to end up in, the NFL or the NBA. right? Pick, MLB, whatever their sport of choice is.
Right.
And I guess to complicate matters even further, does that answer potentially change now that we're in a name, image, likeness era where you can get paid as a college athlete? So I just threw a lot at you. So pick and choose what you want to answer, I guess.
Well, you brought up an interesting point with that first question because my our niece plays softball and she is 9. And she was playing like regular town ball. Town ball is supposed to be fun, and you play a few games in the season and it's great. And I think this is very common. And what happens is town ball is anybody can play. And so you end up having 2 girls, maybe 3 girls on the team who are pretty athletic and pretty good. And the other girls are, not great, but that's okay because it's supposed to be fun and it's an experience, and sports teach us a lot and confidence and all that. But then what happens is you have those 2 to 3 girls who are good. The parents kind of go, I feel like my child isn't really getting better because they're not surrounded by a lot of other girls. What's the answer? Well, this club team, all the girls are really good. And so then that shift ends up going. And that's literally what my niece ended up doing, was shifting away from town ball, going to a club ball, simply because the level of play then is so much better. And when you surround yourself with better athletes. So what's the appropriate age? I mean, by default, our daughter ended up, this is her second season and she's 15 now. So her first club season was 14. I think that's probably an appropriate age to start going, like that beginning of high school age. Simply because from our experience, the middle school sport is volunteer teachers, right? You're not getting a ton of skill development. So the club allows them to have a little bit more official professional like coaches who know what they're doing in the sport. So that's in what I think would be an appropriate age to say, okay, you've learned enough of the game to know what's going on. Now let's transition and find actual volleyball coaches who know what they're doing. And then it sort of helps them prepare a little bit better for those high school seasons. I think if you kind of see, by the time, to answer your second question, by the time they're even sophomore, junior level, if they're not, you can tell if your child is good at the sport or not. And I say this because there are kids. Our son loves to play baseball, but he's never been the best kid on the team. So he might end up playing a little bit in high school, but then he might end up eventually falling off. And so I think we're going to let him decide how much he wants to play. I'm not going to force him to play if he doesn't want to. So I think by the time your kid is in the middle of high school, whether there's enough to move them into college. And then the last question is like, okay, if you're such a small percentage gets paid for this, I guess what's the point in doing college athletics, right? So is there an opportunity, if I go D2 volleyball, what does that mean? Is it because I enjoy it? Am I looking to go pro? Am I looking to gain experience to maybe be a coach? So I think you have to ultimately kind of go, what am I looking to get out of being a college athlete? And is it worth pushing that when that might end up taking away from education, career, and things like that? So I think that's a really tough question to answer. And it's I think a lot dependent on the kid and the kid's personality and really what's going to ultimately, drive them mentally and emotionally into the future.
I'm going to piggyback a little bit and try and focus more on the younger category. So I had to pull this up so I get all the technical terminology right. In baseball, when pitchers tear their UCL, and that is the ulnar collateral ligament, they go through something called a Tommy John surgery. That issue is happening all the way down at the grade school level, but they can't call it Tommy John's anymore because the ligament isn't even developed yet. So you're having kids prior to high school having surgeries from overuse because they are now forced to do one sport and one sport only. I'm trying to remember back to me being in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I wanted to play everything. If you told me you cannot play any other sport, but you're only going to play this, that would not have bode well at all. So if you're literally sitting there and saying, my son is going to be an expert baseball player, and at 6th grade, all he's doing is baseball, like, that's a problem.
Destroying him.
Right? Like anything, and I have this conversation with a lot of people. If you're doing anything for sport, like a true sport, you're now flirting with being unhealthy, period. Because a true sport is going to take something a little bit past average, and you're going to want to move it towards that competitive extreme. And this is where what Julia was talking about, it's going to be highly dependent on the kid, because some kids develop really early and then they'll fizzle out. Some kids develop really late and they won't fizzle out, or they'll develop really late and fizzle out. So my biggest concern is with kids. Like, I remember having gym class and multiple recesses a day, and that has long passed, like over 10 years past. So these movement ability of these kids have drastically decreased, to the point when I was still down in Memphis, I was working with a U6 baseball team. I'm being generous by saying 70% of them could skip. Like a basic skip. They could not understand the function of a skip. And then the second you told them to skip or do a backwards jog, all bets were off. These kids could not move in space, but they could throw a baseball harder than I could ever. So looking at like trying to get it younger and younger and younger, I personally think if you're not in multiple sports, at minimum up until high school, you're being raised and forced to do something. Because again, I'm thinking back to when I was at that age, and all of the other friends that I was talking to, we couldn't hold an attention span long enough to do only one sport. You know what I mean? Like, everything was so easily able to get into with town ball. Like, they made town soccer, basketball, baseball all very easily accessible. But now you have these organizations saying, hey, we're doing practices in off season. We're doing this in 5th grade. So, and people talk about it all the time of being sports specificity and how often you're doing it. That's your first red flag. Like, if you're not in high school yet and you're doing one sport all the time, like, you need to look at what sports do to the human body, because once you step across that line, there is going to be risks involved with sport in any capacity across any paradigm that you go into.
Do you find in your experience that there are certain sports that are particularly egregious? Right. So for example, I'm thinking, like, if someone, I completely agree. Right. Given my limited experience with younger athletes and having been young myself and played, football, basketball, track, and eventually be sort of paring it down to cross country and track. But someone was telling me, like, well, my son plays or my daughter plays soccer all year long. Like, yes, it's sports specific, but I also view it's like, all right, it's a lot of running. If they're doing maybe some strength training, maybe it's just push-ups, sit-ups initially, and eventually they transition to doing actual weight training. I might be like, oh, that's not too bad. Whereas with baseball, I feel like, the demands of baseball are so, I don't know the right term. I'm going to say skill specific and very tendon strength based, right? Where I know, like, nowadays, you mentioned sort of Tommy John surgery. And I know, like, I heard on the radio fairly recently where they were talking about guys coming into the majors, if they haven't had Tommy John surgery, they just expect them to get it within the next year or two.
Yep.
Right? It's just an expected thing. At some point, you get it, and like once you've gotten it, it should be fixed stronger so that you don't have to ever get it again. Right? Do you find that there's so in my head, I would think like I would see baseball for sort of the torque risk of like using your arm to throw. Obviously, football, I would see. I would if I had a shot, I would not let them play football, just because of the concussion risk. I'll be honest.
Yep.
But is there anything do you have similar thoughts, different thoughts?
Well, so there's two ends of the spectrum on this, right? If you, I'm going to try and correlate this so that everybody can kind of make a parallel with the individuals that you work with the most. What section are they in? Like, what is their would you say, main goals?
For CHP, we tend to work with a lot of people that are just either runners that want to be a little stronger or sort of strength athletes that want to add endurance. It's usually one of those two.
The people on the running paradigm, generally speaking, they're going to have the same downfalls that you're going to have to work with, right?
Yeah, generally speaking.
Okay. Generally speaking, on the other end of the paradigm, if you have someone that's more biased to strength and wanting to run, do you find that you're generally going to have to make the same corrective adjustments to their gait or their running?
Yeah. And programming wise, you're sort of starting from the same point usually.
Yes. So those developmental habits come from being or doing something so long for so often, right? The volume that they do it is so high. So now for older individuals, this is kind of an afterthought. You now have to inject the variable of you are having these kids during their most developmental stages in life doing the same things over and over and over again. So I played soccer more than anything when I was a kid. I didn't care to play other sports, right? So in grade school, I played basketball, but my main thing was soccer. In high school, I tried to play basketball, but I'm short and stubby, so that didn't even begin in the first place. One of the main things that I saw, especially for me, is I developed walking on my toes. I got the nickname Twinkle Toes because I was always sprinting all the time, which then led to super tight calves. I have a nasty anterior pelvic tilt, and all of those things were compounded, in my opinion, because of me playing that sport so often all the time, right? So could it have been worse? Absolutely, right? If I get hit in the head with a baseball, like that's a complete paradigm shift. If you get hit in the head football, when I was growing up, you could not play football, period. Like it was non-existent. You could play flag football and that was it. There were hardcore rules against certain age groups playing full contact football, like super hard.
Those don't exist in Ohio.
Right. But that's non-existent now because you have all of these clubs that are trying to develop these kids at a young age. Dude, if you're 6 years old and you're wearing 20 pounds of gear, like you're literally now borderline strength training. Like you're running around with gear on and you're doing, like you said, high impact stuff. So I agree with you. There are going to be some sports that take a drastic toll on individuals depending on the amount they do it out of the year. But that's why the way I was raised in the industry, and I know she was too, is being multiple sports all the time to offset one another is like, you can look at it like education, like a well-rounded education. You're having all of these different attributes that you're learning to do through these different venues or sports, which then allows you to develop better than just one area.
I can appreciate that answer. I think my perspective is probably a little closer to yours, Anthony, in that not to say that, because I never played soccer, so I can't speak for that, but my thought when you first asked that question was, oh, yeah, soccer player running around the field. There's nothing overly specific, and the nature of the game is very dynamic, right? There's no set like play, there's no set, you're kind of just moving all over the place. And so the body is generally very reactive. Where in baseball, that motion is kind of
repetitive.
unnatural.
Yeah, it's
Yes,
unnatural and
it's
repetitive.
super repetitive, and the torque put on it in order to be able to do that well is very high. So my original thought when you asked that question was those types of sports. It's probably a spectrum. Baseball and softball are probably at the highest. I would even say something like a
Tennis.
swimming.
Yeah,
Swimming
tennis
would be tennis. Same thing, because you've got that nature, that repetitive overuse, awkward movement that's just not quite as natural. Probably comes down the spectrum. And then you get down, and even something like cycling, which should be a very, basic skill set for a lot of people.
Go ride your bike. Like, that's the normal thing you hear as a kid.
But then think about an actual cyclist. They're like super hunched over. The hip flexors are tight, right? So it's like anything you do. So I do think it kind of is on this pendulum of baseball maybe being at the highest spot, and soccer is somewhere in the middle. But generally speaking, I would probably say somebody playing soccer might have less of those problems than, say, a baseball player. But overall, I think you're going to still end up with massive compensations either way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, we sort of seeing it with adult athletes, like as adults, most of our listeners are probably adults. Excuse me. And ourselves, I think we all know, like, as Christian, you were saying, you see it in yourself, the things that you've done. I'm sure as all the years you spent powerlifting, you've developed, certain grooves. Like, I could put you in a squat, and I know you're going to squat. Your squat's going to look pretty much the exact same 99.99% of the time.
Right.
My squat, yeah, some days it might look one way, some days it might look very differently. And this is from someone that, it's not like I haven't squatted over the last 30 years. Like, I squat, I just haven't done it as much or as heavy as you have. Right? It hasn't been my focus. Right. And that's probably come with, there's trade-offs there, right? Obviously, you're a lot stronger, right? But there's probably things that you don't move as well, or certain movements that maybe you don't do as well now because of that.
100%.
And I actually want to kind of stake that point, which can be dragged literally across any age group. When you're trying to develop kids, for your squat, for instance, is there a squat pattern that you can do more consistently every time as opposed to a different squat variation? Right? So if you have a kid that comes in and they can't do like a karaoke, right? The karaoke where you're like sideways and it's like you're rotating your hips back and forth. What movement can I get this kid to discern the difference between their hips being locked to their torso and they can't separate that, right? So that's an issue for any athlete whatsoever. Swimmers, every swimmer that I have dealt with in the last X amount of time have literally had the hardest time with a hip hinge. So what can I do? Their hip and their spine is like fused because of that sport. So what can I do to make them get the best hip hinge possible to make them move better? What squat variation can you or your runners do that you don't have to rack your brain and go, wow, my squat feels so off? Is there a variation that you can go back to every time that is the most consistent? Again, a lot of people get scared of variation or different approaches to how they need to particularly move. And this is a big thing with kids. Like, a lot of times people will have kids start messing around with the weight room and messing around with movement patterns, but they are specific movement patterns that they might not be capable of doing.
Mm-hmm.
So learning to regress movement of all fashions, whether that's a barbell or literal body weight, like there is a massive gap in movement progressions and strength training progressions that go across the board that I think also needs to be kind of like not an afterthought, but really thought of for people coming into these new realms, right? When kids come into the realm of weightlifting, or when your runners come into the realm of wanting to get stronger, they have a concept of, oh, I need to squat. Squatting looks drastically different for everybody.
Yeah, definitely. So, great point. I completely agree. And to answer for me particularly, my front squat's completely fine. That one's very consistent.
Right?
My front squat always feels the same. Back squat, yeah.
Sure, sure.
So, it's taking a step away from movement regression and figuring out, how to build up to, maybe a barbell squat or something like that for someone. Thinking about you mentioned these different groups and traveling teams, and them trying to develop this pipeline. And so this is completely off the topic of athletic development, but I'm just curious, since you have children at that age or about that age, how broken slash corrupt do you feel that system is or has the potential to be?
So,
Because I've heard horror stories. Let's put it that way. Like I've heard some, you hear horror stories of like some of this stuff just being like fraudulent or just not good. Like you all said that, I think Christian, you mentioned how much money is involved with traveling sports, right? Money brings people to the table that, you could certainly come to, get involved and be like, I am really interested in children's, well-being and athletic development and friendships. And I want to, give them, a sporting opportunity. And yeah, am I going to make some money on the side? Of course, right? I think most of us chose jobs as coaches, partially because, we like to do it, right? We like to help people, but also we need to put food on the table, right? So I have no doubt that those people exist. But I also feel like the more money's involved, which it sounds like there's a lot, because parents are willing to pay, it's going to invite people that the children are not the main focus of what they're trying to do. Thoughts?
I think it just like anything, it has the potential, and I'm sure there are some very corrupt organizations and people. And maybe because I tend to be a little optimistic, but I think my hope, I guess, is that as this whole, people like us who are in this movement of let's sort of make children's sports a little healthier. And now that strength and conditioning is becoming a little bit more wide known, and kids training 30 years ago was unheard of, right? And now that it's a little more well known, and you have people who, were in the fitness, still very new industry 20 years ago, are now sort of really speaking out about. My hope is that you have more people who really have that best interest at heart and that will seek out. If I'm a club baseball coach owner, I'm going to put my ego aside and say, okay, I don't have all the answers. I want my kids to develop properly. Let me bring in an expert that can teach my kids XYZ. I think at least some of the people that I've seen are really starting to do a little bit more of that. There are some really good organizations out there that are trying to do the best that they can, but there are some really really bad ones because of the money involved. Again, kids are paying thousands of dollars to be on a sports team. I'd like to think that as the years progress, people that are our age now with young kids can continue to try to change the industry slowly. So as the years go by, it now becomes standard, right, to have a strength coach that will consult with these organizations, or chiropractors or PTs, or somebody outside of the egotistical, guy that just wants to, run his little kids' football heads, through the ground. So I think we're starting to see that a little bit, where people are starting to branch out and pair up with chiropractors and strength coaches and things like that. I think it's going to take time, because there's still an underlying motive of money. And can I get my kid, if I'm the parent or if I'm the coach, can I get my superstar player to reach the highest level? Because now that gives me clout, right?
Right.
So I don't know. That was my thought.
Use the word clout.
I did use the word clout.
This is our kids' terms getting thrown onto us. So I'm much less optimistic
There
when
we
it
go.
comes to this realm. And the reason for that is I'm gonna start my opinion with a question. When is the last time that you heard of any type of scout being at a school function? So any type of when I was growing up,
Yeah, I mean,
you
when I
would,
was a kid, scouts would show up, I guess, but
right, but they would show up to your high school.
Right.
yeah, that's what I remember.
You don't have that anymore. Scouts are now coming to club games because the club is where the top of the top kids are going to be developed. And then these teams that are doing really well and paying big money to travel, paying big money to play against other big teams, they are getting these coaches and these scouts to come in, even on a high school basis. So my stories, I just recently, probably about a year ago, I had two brothers all year round, 100% of the year baseball. All they did was baseball. During the winter, they would make two trips down south to Florida to continue baseball development leagues, all of that stuff. And these leagues and developmental camps were being ran by their clubs, but they were being marketed as these scouts will be here. So these organizations were strictly putting on summer camps where professional scouts were being present to give them an upper hand to get in the limelight or get in the visual front of people at higher levels of colleges and club teams at that level. So you are not going to get your child to develop and then progress just by playing school sports anymore. You have to get them into the club circuit, and you have to get them in front of these eyes to even have a chance. Mm-hmm. And the times that it doesn't happen is if you have just a stud athlete, which there are a lot more out there than people think, that just do a walk-on at some college and just crush it. And they're like, where have you been? And they were never in the club system to begin with because they just didn't care to. And these two kids that were doing that, they were in 8th grade. Like they weren't even in high school yet. And they were every year being flown down by their parents to do these clubs, to be in front of these scouts.
Do we see high school sports changing as a result of this, or is it just going to be high school and sort of club sports kind of running parallel to one another?
I think, I don't know at what point, if it will be 10 years or what, but I do, because we're already seeing it with town sports like recreational leagues. And even now you can see, even when talking to certain athletes and their parents, that there is like, they're already putting a higher emphasis on the club team over the high school team. So if that kid and that parent thinks that they can get more exposure and go to Florida and get in front of these scouts and see more, be around the country more and get more exposure rather than being locked into their high school season for 3 months, of course they're going to go off and do something else. I think you will. I think some of those top level high school kids are going to eventually only go club, and then your high school sports are. I mean, they'll still have kids on the team, but I don't think they'll be as competitive as they.
No.
Mm-mm. So,
Do you in your experience, have you noticed a difference with athlete development just in general between males and females? If you're a parent, is there anything you should be looking for in particular? Do you have sons versus daughters in terms of things they maybe should be doing to prevent certain injuries or not?
So this is the struggle we have with our daughter, right? She is now at a competitive level where you need to start doing strength training. But our daughter is also a teen, so that's not attractive to her at all. She's more worried about boys than she is like, hey, I need to work out because I'm going to get crushed in volleyball. Now, backstory, our daughter has very flat feet and she's basically knock-kneed. And we had to get her sport athletic insoles, and we're strength coaches. We're really big on not forcing our kid to do something she doesn't want to do. When she goes to the weight room, she crushes it.
Mm-hmm.
When she goes to the weight room, she crushes it. We give her full access to do it, right? If she's not doing it, you will have an instant response from her of when she's not doing anything, she's in pain.
Yeah.
Now, she didn't have any developmental issues. This is her being long-legged and being in a very high impact sport of jumping all the time that does not bode well for her structure. And she was not on the front end of that. It was, I want to play volleyball first. Oh, crap. I have all of these kind of downfalls of my structure and my gait that have to be fixed. Right. So I partially went off on a tangent there.
A little bit. That's okay, though. But males and females, I mean, yes and no. When it comes down to the core of training male and female athletes, we know, generally speaking, they all need to know how to squat, hinge, single leg, right? All of these basic movements. But you will find one of the biggest things, and I always laugh about this because it has nothing to do with developmentally, but your female athletes are going to be more attentive to detail and better listeners, 100%, than your boys ever will. And which is great for that aspect, because the girls, when they start to figure out their bodies, they end up really falling in love with strength training. I think I have seen in all the young athletes I've coached that, generally speaking, girls will look at strength training and go, wow, this is really important to my development as an athlete. And the guys kind of go, this is just something my coach is making me do. So I think that's something, and maybe that's because it's the boys sort of, I just need to play my sport. Like, I'm good enough. I don't need anything else kind of an attitude. But I think for girls, you can use that to your advantage. For the boys, I think sometimes it's definitely a barrier that you have to break down in order to get them to understand that. And if they are into weight training, they certainly don't want to regress, right? They're squatting wrong. Dude can squat 300, but he looks like crap. Now, our job is to regress that and get him to actually do it correctly. You try telling that to a 16-year-old football player, like, no way, he doesn't want to do that. And so that, I think, is a big struggle when you're talking about the difference between males and females. But I think generally the the basic movements of what you want most of those, middle school, young high school age kids to do is going to be generally pretty similar.
Yeah, and the biggest weak areas with kids coming in is what I see posterior chain. Just generally speaking, posterior chain for them is the weakest through and through.
100%. Yeah.
I think that applies to most athletes I see come in as well. So I don't think it changes. Any other thoughts you have on athlete development early on, or issues you see?
From an age standpoint, teaching younger kids, like if you're in the range of sixth grade, probably being early, like just learning how to move properly. Like I'm not even talking about weight room stuff, but actively knowing how to move your body in space far outweighs getting stronger.
Yeah.
Right? You're not going to develop any kind of crazy muscle in your middle school time, right? But the lack of dynamic or locomotion that younger kids have now is by far the worst that I've seen since getting into. I started in nursing school and then into exercise sports science. Like it has gotten worse since then. It definitely hasn't gotten better. So that's my biggest thing, having these kids come in and I'm like, you guys are great at this sport. You can't move if your life depended on it. Like you're tripping over yourself left and right. And it's just like that there's a massive gap here. And it looks great on me, right? You teach them how to move and all of a sudden they're doing better. And I was like, well, that was easy. Like it's nothing crazy. It's literally teaching them going back to the basics. And I'm super, super general in my approach. Like I do not try and do any fancy stuff at all. And starting there is super annoying for like high school athletes, but it just shows them right in their face, like, wow, this is difficult. And I feel like it shouldn't be.
Skipping.
Yeah, skipping. And they were like, this is stupid. And I was like, is it though? Like you can't do it.
You can't do it.
There you go. Julia and Christian, if someone wants to get in contact with you, how can they do so?
Easiest way would say would be Instagram. Both of us are pretty active on Instagram. My Instagram is Julia Anto. If you just search my name, Christian's is just Anto. Search his name, you can find us. You can email works well. Mine is juliaanto1315@gmail.
Mine's the number 19, CANTO, the number 85@gmail. We both have websites. Mine's www.mohawkmethod.com.
Mine is www.julialadusky.com. You can, we have forms to fill out if clients are interested in our services. We both do online coaching. We do in-person coaching. So follow-up questions, just hit us up.
And you are all based in the Chicago area, correct?
We're just outside Chicago in Northwest Indiana. So we are close enough we're about 30 minutes from the actual city of Chicago. But we're in Northwest Indiana. So anybody that's even in Midwest, we've had people come up, down from Michigan and, Wisconsin and stuff. So we're active at a lot of powerlifting meets in the Chicago area. So by all means, anybody that needs to come in for a consultation at our gym, they're welcome to do that. We can do, form checks and things like that. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, you can follow myself on Instagram at Durazio Anthony for the few times I post. You can follow at Complete Human Performance on Instagram as well. What links to our website and for all the fun stuff and like the shirt I'm wearing. There you go. I am wearing a shirt.
Oh, there you go.
You can find it through the link below as well. Christian and Julia, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Anthony.